It's usually pretty easy to tell the difference between a presidential speech and an opera performance. Differentiating between speech and song is something that doesn't take a great deal of cognitive resources for you and me. And we even use music or language-specific knowledge to extract meaning from each domain. For instance, in song, we pay more attention to the relationships among pitches and intervals, whereas in speech, we pay more attention to the relationships among syllables and words in order to comprehend a sentence. But the difference between speech and song is not always so clear-cut. So for instance, sounds such as these have acoustic characteristics that could be perceived as either speech or song. One such example of this is infant-directed speech. So instead of just saying, "Hi, how are you?" to our infants, we say, "Hi, how are you?" to our infants, almost singing the message instead of speaking it. So here I have pitch tracings of song, speech, and infant-directed speech in the middle. For song, the pitch is very stable over the course of the utterance, and so you can compare pitch information as it unfolds over time. In speech, the pitch information takes second fiddle to the linguistic content, and in infant-directed speech, these grand contour pitch exaggerations take center stage and actually become the most salient feature of the signal. This feature has led researchers since the 80s to say that for infant-directed speech, perhaps actually the melody is the message. So this blurring of the lines between speech and song brings up some pretty interesting questions in development, particularly when in development do we learn to differentiate between speech and song? And also, when do we learn to apply music or language-specific knowledge depending on the perceived domain? And so in my research, I'm using ambiguous sounds to understand what acoustic characteristics adults and children use to differentiate between speech and song, and also when in development they learn to use music or language-specific knowledge. So for instance, if a child is rating how well a student sings for a musical, they ought to pay more attention to the pitch information and intervals in order to make that judgment. Whereas that same child, when they're comparing how well a student has done delivering a line for a play, they ought to pay more attention to the syllables and word order in order to make that judgment. So this research has some clinical importance too. Children with autism have difficulty inhibiting irrelevant pitch information when they're processing speech. And so by characterizing the timeline in typically developing children and adults, we can help clinicians to diagnose language processing deficits perhaps earlier in development. And also we can use a paradigm like this in order to train kids with autism how to hone in on the relevant acoustic characteristics in the signal. So thank you very much for listening, and remember, teasing apart speech and song is not mere child's play.